I always thought the worst betrayal I'd ever face would come from a stranger, not from the very people I loved the most. But that night, and when my own son carried me to bed, I uncovered a truth that shattered my world. Life has a way of throwing curveballs at you, and sometimes they're so sharp, they cut right through your soul. I was just an ordinary woman living an ordinary life. A husband I thought I knew inside out, a son I adored, and a home we built together over decades. But behind the walls of our seemingly perfect house, secrets were growing like weeds in a neglected garden. This is my story. It's raw, heartbreaking, and filled with betrayal. But it's also a cautionary tale for anyone who thinks they truly know the people closest to them. It all started with a seemingly innocent accident. I'd slipped on the icy stairs outside our home one cold December evening, twisting my leg so badly that I couldn't walk for weeks. My son, Daniel, rushed to my aid, carrying me inside and laying me gently on the couch. His strength and care reminded me of how he'd always been my rock. Little did I know, this moment of vulnerability would be the beginning of my unraveling. My husband, James, was at work when it happened. Or at least that's what I believed. He arrived home hours later, his face pale, his shirt smelling faintly of perfume. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, James worked in a corporate office where appearances mattered. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to notice things I couldn't ignore. James's phone, once left carelessly on the kitchen counter, was now glued to his hand. The once familiar chime of notifications became a constant presence, filling the silence of our home with an unspoken tension. His late-night meetings became more frequent, and his affection toward me grew distant, mechanical even. It wasn't just the physical distance, it was the way his words felt empty, rehearsed. He'd say, "I love you," while looking past me, as though the phrase itself were just an obligation. I tried to convince myself it was just stress, that the long hours at work were taking their toll. He's providing for us, I told myself over and over, trying to ignore the growing chasm between us. But deep down, a small, nagging voice told me otherwise. It whispered in the quiet moments during the long nights I spent alone in our bed. Something was wrong, something more than stress or work. Then there was Daniel. At 22, he was still living at home while finishing his studies. He'd always been a quiet, observant boy, the kind of son who preferred listening to talking. But lately, his demeanor had shifted. He seemed nervous, distracted. He'd jump at the sound of his phone vibrating or hesitate when I asked him simple questions. One evening, as he helped me upstairs to my bedroom, I noticed the way his eyes darted away when I asked about his father. His response was quick, almost too quick. "He's just busy, Mom." The words were meant to reassure me, but his tone did the opposite. The weight of dependence. Weeks passed, and my recovery from surgery forced me to depend on both James and Daniel more than ever. It was humbling, relying on them for everything from meals to moving around the house, but it also gave me a front row seat to their behaviors. James's absence grew more pronounced, his excuses more convoluted. Traffic was horrible, he'd mutter when coming home late, his tie loosened, his shirt slightly wrinkled. He avoided eye contact as he kissed my forehead, the gesture feeling more like a performance than an act of love. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed to be wrestling with something internal. He'd linger in doorways, watching me as though he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. I began to notice subtle interactions between him and James. Shared glances, unfinished sentences that hinted at an unspoken tension. The air in our home felt heavier, like a storm was brewing just out of sight. A storm brews. One night, unable to sleep, I hobbled downstairs on my crutches to get a glass of water. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that amplifies every creak and rustle. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard it, muffled voices coming from the living room. James and Daniel were arguing, their whispers sharp and urgent. I froze, leaning against the wall to steady myself, straining to catch their words. "If she finds out, it'll destroy her." James's voice was low but charged with emotion. Daniel's reply was quick, almost panicked. "I told you this would happen! We should have stopped before it got this far!" My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. What were they talking about? What could they possibly be hiding from me? I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as I shuffled closer, careful to stay hidden in the shadows. My mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. Clues began to unfold. The days that followed were a blur of suspicion and quiet observation. I began to piece together fragments of conversations, half-finished sentences that hung in the air like unanswered questions. James's behavior grew more erratic. He'd leave the house abruptly, his phone clutched tightly in his hand, his expression unreadable. Daniel, too, seemed on edge, his usually calm demeanor replaced by a nervous energy that made him avoid my gaze. Then one afternoon, while tidying up the living room, I found a receipt tucked between the couch cushions. It was for a dinner at an upscale restaurant, one I hadn't been to in years. The date on the receipt matched a night James had claimed to be working late. My stomach churned as I stared at the piece of paper, my mind spiraling into dark territory. A confrontation. That evening, I decided to confront James. As he walked through the door, his face immediately registered the tension in the room. I held up the receipt, my hand trembling. "What is this, James?" I asked, my voice steady but laced with emotion. He froze, his eyes darting to the receipt and then to me. For a moment, I thought I saw guilt flash across his face, but he quickly composed himself. "It's nothing," he said, his tone dismissive. "A business dinner. You know how these things are." But I wasn't convinced. "Who were you with?" I pressed, my voice rising slightly. "I told you it was work," he replied, his tone growing defensive. "Why are you questioning me like this?" Before I could respond, Daniel walked into the room, his face pale. "Mom, maybe you should just let it go," he said quietly, his eyes pleading with me. That's when I knew. Whatever this was, Daniel was involved too. The revelation. The following night, unable to bear the tension any longer, I demanded the truth. Sitting both James and Daniel down in the living room, I looked them in the eyes and said, "No more lies. I deserve to know what's going on." James sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated," he began, his voice tinged with regret. "Then make it simple," I shot back, my patience wearing thin. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding my gaze. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, it's about the money." My breath caught in my throat. "What money?" James hesitated before answering. "The loans. I've been in over my head. Daniel found out, and he's been trying to help. That's why things have been so tense. A fragile piece." The revelation hit me like a ton of bricks. Anger, relief, and confusion swirled inside me. While it wasn't the betrayal I had feared, the secrecy and lies had still cut deep. Over the next few weeks, we began to rebuild, slowly, painfully. James sought help for his financial troubles, and Daniel finally opened up about the stress he'd been under. But the scars of those weeks lingered, a reminder of how fragile trust can be and how quickly it can erode when secrets take its place. My heart raced as I stood there, hidden in the shadows. "If she finds out," those words echoed in my mind like a haunting melody. What were they hiding? I couldn't confront them then, not like this. I needed proof. The next day, while James was at work and Daniel was out running errands, I took a risk. I searched James's study, digging through drawers and files. That's when I found it. A small, hidden envelope stuffed with receipts and photos. The receipts showed extravagant purchases. Jewelry, dinners at upscale restaurants, hotel stays, but it was the photos that made my blood run cold. There she was, a woman half my age smiling coyly at the camera, her arms wrapped around James. The dates on the back of the photos matched the nights he'd claimed to be working late. I felt the walls closing in on me, the air thick and suffocating. But the real dagger came later that night when I confronted James. He didn't deny it. Instead, he dropped another bombshell. It's not just me. Daniel knew. He's known for months. The betrayal cut deeper than I ever imagined. It wasn't just my husband's infidelity. It was the knowledge that my son, my flesh and blood, had kept it from me. The two people I trusted most had conspired to shield me from the truth, thinking it would protect me, but all it did was shatter my faith in them. In the days that followed, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let their betrayal define me. I began the slow, painful process of rebuilding. Not just my leg, but my life. I sought therapy, found strength in friends, and reclaimed my independence. And while forgiveness felt impossible at first, I learned that letting go of the anger was the only way to truly heal. If you found this story as compelling as I did living it, don't forget to subscribe for more. Or stick around and watch the next video. You won't want to miss it.